My name is Frederic Stasek with California Families Rise, and I am going to present a history of CPS, where they've been and where they're headed. But first, I want to tell why it is that I have this interest. My son was taken by CPS in 2007. He was taken because he had been mistreated in a hospital by a doctor, causing him extreme pain and psychological distress. I asked one of the two attending physicians if they could sign him out of the hospital and send him home, and that attending physician agreed and helped me make an appointment with a psychiatrist in Santa Rosa. The other attending physician, the treating physician, called Child Protective Services and reported that I was putting my son at risk of abuse because I had, quote unquote, berated doctors in the presence of the minor. This was a bold-faced lie, since I hadn't even spoken to the doctors in the presence of the minor. But truth is not a major element in these functions. My son was taken from me when he was almost dead, when he was physically paralyzed, quadriplegic, when he was traumatized into dissociation. He was taken from me for, among other reasons, because I had asked for him to be released from the hospital. When the court convened, it took 15 minutes for my son to be taken. I was not allowed to speak. What was said of the situation was not true, was false. But nonetheless, they took my son, and that ushered in 3 years of utter terror. I would awake at night after 2.5, 3 hours of passing out, and the first thing that I would experience was utter terror. That was the first thing I was aware of when I came to consciousness. And the next thing that I became aware of was the question, how can this be happening? How is this even possible? How can they take my child after they've tortured him almost to death? So that is what I'm going to answer with this broadcast, is what gives CPS the power to do what they do? How come they can do it? And what's being done about it? The first foster child was recorded in 1636 in the colony of Jamestown. That was Benjamin Eaton. Foster care was an institution of servitude. Foster children were expected to work for their foster families and would be manumitted at the age of 21. But it was very clearly in the interest of the foster parents, so-called, that the child was taken. There were a few instances of institutional care for children in what were called poorhouses or almshouses that housed anybody that was needy or couldn't take care of themselves, crazy people, sick people, the old, the infirm, as well as orphans. But mainly foster children, foster families were the means of caring for children whose parents had passed away. In any case, this tradition continued for some 200 years until 1853, when Charles Loring Brace established what were then called the orphan trains. Charles Loring Brace also founded what he called the Children's Aid Society of New York. And his practice was, for the first time, the effort was to, or the effort that they said was to benefit the child. And Charles Loring Brace would have children taken off the streets, street urchins, and housed until they could be sent en masse via train to Western states where he felt they would benefit from working under the bright sky and sunlight. So these children were loaded into train cars, and early on they were little more than box cars with no toilet facilities and no seats. And they were sent to places like Des Moines and Kansas City, where they would be displayed, and then families that wanted foster children, in other words, servants, would pick out which children they wanted. The children weren't informed of where they were going, and they didn't have a say in the matter. Likewise, the parents of these children, if they existed, were ignored. There's one letter from a mother to Charles Loring Brace that said, "Please don't send my child out west in a train. He is not an orphan. I am his mother. I am in the hospital." The letter was ignored and the child was sent. This established a pattern that was followed several decades later. And the pattern was that a child was, without their consent, was benefited according to the benefactor. The parents were ignored, the child was ignored, and the benefactor basically served what they felt were the best interests of the minor. In 1874, the first trial involving taking a child from a parent was performed. The child's name is Mary Ellen Wilson, also known as Mary Ellen McCormick. Mary Ellen Wilson was abused by her foster mother to the extent that she was sliced with scissors, beaten, and traumatized horribly. Somebody, and I can't remember the name of this person, recognized that there was abuse going on, investigated it, and reported Mary Ellen Wilson's condition to the SPCA, the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. SPCA appointed a social worker to look into the case, and the social worker hired a lawyer, and the case was brought to court. The court took Mary Ellen Wilson from her foster mom and from her abusive foster mom, and sent Mary Ellen Wilson to an institution, an orphanage, which, according to what I read, was little better than the foster mom. But the institution, the SPCA, washed its hands of the business. The child was taken from the abusive parents, and that was all done. Now, what ended up happening was the sponsor, the social worker that was appointed within the SPCA, eventually adopted Mary Ellen Wilson out of the abusive orphanage. And that was how it was eventually resolved. But that was essentially the practice that is now practiced in 2022. There is a beneficent organization. There is a victim child, a minor. There is a perpetrator parent, and there is the power of the court. The benefactor saves the victim from the perpetrator through the auspices of the court and washes their hands of the business. The next year after this trial, the SPCA split off and formed the SPCC, the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And that institution persisted until the early 1900s. There were 150 other organizations that did much the same thing. Now, also during this period, the child advocates, as they called themselves, also worked on child labor laws. And in that, they were successful. And while other labor organizations were restricting the number of hours that citizens could work, and I believe instituting unions, the child labor laws were changed to the benefit of children, and that was actually a very good thing. In 1903, I believe it was 18 80. Now I don't have the date in my mind, but that the one state began the practice of ensuring that every child that entered a foster home was there at the order of the court. So during this period in the late 1800s, it was established that the taking of a child would go through a court. In 1903, three women established what they called the Children's Bureau, which was dedicated to protecting children from want and from harm, from neglect and from abuse. And they interfaced with the government and tried to get this institution established within the government. In 1915, after several tries, the Children's Bureau was established in the federal government to look after this matter of children being taken from their parents and put in foster homes. At this time, the only children that were served were children that were being neglected. This didn't apply to abused children, even though Mary Ellen Wilson was abused. This effort was used primarily, if not entirely, to take children from families that couldn't care for them and put them in foster homes or institutions. At the beginning of the 1800s, there were 6 orphanages in the country. And by the end of the century, by the beginning of the 1900s, there were over 1,000 orphanages in the US. It wasn't until 1960 that the number of children in foster care exceeded the number of children in institutions, in orphanages. In 1935, the federal government issued its first funding for these child rescuing efforts, and that was through the Welfare Act, also known as Title IV. And this was the first instance of the federal government funding child abuse and neglect prevention. In 1974, the government instituted its first its first effort to coordinate and own the efforts of these child protection institutions throughout the 50 states. And this was the act known as CAPTA, or the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. This was written by those within the child protection institutions and favored them greatly. And their job was to protect children from harm and abuse. And they throughout these decades, they wrote very well of their intentions and what they were resolving. They were excellent writers, and they made an extremely good case for what they did and the suffering of the children who needed to be saved. These were the ones that wrote CAPTA, that supplied the text for CAPTA. And after CAPTA was passed, it passed by a vast majority in both the House and the Senate. And immediately as it was passed, the new Child Protection Services, or Department of Families and Children, it's called different things, began taking children like it was going out of style. And within 4 years, they had taken 25 to 35% of the minor population of Native Americans, particularly. And most of these there was 25 to 35% of the Indian population, juvenile population, was in foster care. And most of the foster care was in non-Indian homes. So this was much the same of an attack on the culture of American Indians as were the Indian schools earlier in the century, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, although the taking of children to put in Indian schools was done by the Bureau of Indian Affairs rather than the Children's Bureau. In any case, Congress, after these 4 years, was alarmed. Congress said, oh, wait a minute, that's too many children. There's too many children in foster care, and separating families is cruel. So they passed ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. And the number of children in foster care plummeted to almost what it had been previously. And what I'm going to show you here is the number of acts that were passed by Congress to deal with this issue, the child welfare and child abuse prevention and treatment. But you can see how this act is passed in 1974, and right away Congress is going to town to amend it. We have the reform, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment and Adoption Reform Act of 1978, along with the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, Child Abuse Prevention, Adoption and Family Services Act of 1988, the Child Abuse, Domestic Violence, Adoption and Family Services Act of 1992. Until finally we get to the much ballyhooed ASFA, the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997. Now, the primary issue with ASFA was the recognition that foster care sucks. Just as ICWA recognized that foster care sucks, and also that separating families is harmful and cruel, ASFA recognized that foster care was not an ideal place for children to be, and offered the solution of adopting children out of foster care into adoptive homes, and offered incentives, cash incentives, monetary incentives that went to the departments. These incentives never went to individuals, only to departments. It was only to award the departments when they exceeded the number of adoptees out of foster care. This had to be adoptions from foster care, and it could also be legal guardianships. And the money was then allotted to the CPS departments and had to be used for programs that were already being funded. But if you look in this chart, you can see how here's 1997 was when ASFA was passed. And here we go to 1997. I hope you can see that red line. And there is the number of children who were in foster care is at a very high rate. It rises again for the next couple years until 1999, where it peaks, and it finds the maximum ever in 1999. And then the number of children in foster care begins to descend. So actually, ASFA was a revision that recognized that foster care is not an ideal place for children, and attempted to resolve it by adopting them out. Now, I need to put up another chart here, and this is the foster care system. Come on. Okay, so here is the same graph with I've added some extra notations here. This green line that you see here is the number of children in foster care. I couldn't find any charts that charted it past 2000, that charted the number of children in foster care past 2015. Likewise, this red line that you see here is the number of children entering foster care, which peaked around 2007, right when my child was being taken by CPS, and began to descend. The number of children entering foster care, which is a proxy for the number of children taken by CPS, begins to descend. I'm not sure what acts there were that prompted that decline, but it is an indication that Congress, our lawmakers, recognize that not only does foster care suck, but that separating families is wrong. In fact, separating families is a crime against humanity as recognized by the UN Commission on Human Rights. And anyone who has had their child taken well knows what a crime it is, and the level of disruption, sorrow, and pain that it causes. Congress recognizes that, as well as recognizing, especially recognizing, that foster care is not an ideal place for kids. The typical foster child is represented by that lonely child dragging a black plastic bag, a quarter full of everything they own in the world, from one unwanted home to the next. Foster care is a horrible place for children, and the ideal is that, well, it's better than abusive parents. Now, the problem is that the abuse that parents supposedly do is a free-for-all. The institution, Child Protective Services, can basically come up with any reason they want, as long as they have lots of reasons and they all agree on it. These are allegations, not reason. I was accused, for instance, of being too kind to my son, along with berating doctors in the presence of the minor. I pleaded that down to criticizing doctors in the presence of the minor, and I pleaded it down rather than standing up to them because I feared for my child's life. I did not trust them. I saw that they lied. I saw that they had no honor, no integrity, and that it pleased them to separate the family. These people jeered at my son, sneered at me. It gave them pleasure to rip my family to shreds, and it was clear that that was what they enjoyed doing. Now, Congress has recognized not only that foster care sucks, and as in ICWA, that separating families is a wrongful act. I want to bring up an act, the very recent act, and I can't remember the name, so I'm going to have to bring it up here. Oh, darn. And that act is the Family First, sorry about that, the Family First, oh geez, no thank you. The Family First Prevention Services Act. And I want to read you, this is from 2018. The Family First Prevention Services Act was enacted to turn the focus of the current child welfare system toward keeping children safely with their families to avoid the trauma that results when children are placed in out-of-home care. To increase the number of children who can remain safely at home with their families, the law provides families with greater access to mental health services, substance use treatment, and/or improved parenting skills. Now, what that shows is that this is, let's see where 2018 is, right about there. You can see that the number of children begins to decline steeply after 2018. By the time 2020 is approached, we are deep into COVID, and I'm imagining that this line continues to plunge. I'm also imagining that this line continues to plunge, and that we now have fewer children in foster care than we have since, this is an estimate, since 1990, well before ASFA. So that is a recognition that Congress is onto this. They're doing a good job with a difficult subject, but they are doing this. They're doing this. Oh man, I can't see without my glasses. They're doing this with a recognition that one, foster care sucks, and two, that separating families is a crime against humanity, absent a damn good reason. And what CPS does all hinges on what is a damn good reason. And I need to point out that their damn good reasons are as absurd as is the practice of taking families and destroying them, ripping them to shreds. Children are taken because the parents smoke pot, because they let their child walk to the park alone, because they ask for a second opinion, similar to what happened to my family. The standard for taking children, for reasons for taking children's, is absent. They basically can use any reason that they all agree on, and if they agree on it, they've got their child. Now, what this institution does is it creates jobs for a whole bunch of people. I've estimated the number of people involved in this industry to be about 3 million people. I haven't read that anywhere. That's just my best guess. What I did read was that for the year 2020, the total budget for this grand enterprise, this institution that includes the judges, bailiffs, lawyers, lots of lawyers. They have lawyers serving lawyers, alternate lawyers. There's lots of lawyers involved in this. Social workers who trade out with the client. They don't stay with the minor, as they call them. This institution includes caregivers, service providers, social workers, supervisors, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors, foster parents, and institutions. $30 billion a year. Now, I want to put the financial incentives that go with the ASFA practice of adopting children out of foster care. I want to put that in perspective. Now, I read that in 2021, the total amount of incentive money sent to the CPS institutions in the country, all over the country, was $73 million. $73 million to take children and do something with them. That's basically what it is. Now, that's $73 million is a little over 0.2%, we'll say 0.3% of 30 billion. So they're using 0.3% of the total budget to take children and do something with them. Now, the other 99.7% of the funding goes to taking children and doing something with them. It's all the same. They take children, and the taking of the child is a horrendous act. Also, what I noticed is that beginning in 2016, families were separated at the border, and that raised the ire of a lot of people and brought attention to this matter. And it may have something to do with the act, which name I cannot remember for the life of me, the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018. So the claims about ASFA being the source of these problems is simply inaccurate. In fact, ASFA, like ICWA and like the Family Services Act of 2018, is actually a restraint upon the overreach of CAPTA. And what needs to happen, however many laws we have already passed, what needs to happen is that the accurate is that welfare timeline, all these acts are trying to bring CAPTA into line with what the rest of the country understands to be principle. We need to have passed, the lawmakers need to pass laws that restrict the takery of children, separating families, ripping families to shreds. A crime against humanity needs to be minimized. I will recognize that children sometimes need to be seized from their abusive families, but also it needs to be recognized by society that destroying families is about as cruel and destructive as you can get, and that this practice is despicable, except in cases where it actually saves the child. And that number, my estimate, is probably 5% of the children seized actually deserve to be seized, and the other 95%, just based on my experience and based on talking to hundreds, maybe thousands of people since my child was taken, is that most of this is unnecessary. The problem is that all these people make a living. As one lawyer told me, it's their bread and butter. Their living depends on children being taken by the state. I need to get, there we go. The children are taken by the state. And this is an act that is as cruel and needs to be revised. If as per ASFA, reducing the number of children in foster care is the right kind and reasonable thing to do, which it is, it should be recognized that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And maybe we shouldn't be taking those children in the first place. And the problem is that with the pound of cure is what funds everybody. It pays their salaries. And the ounce of prevention, it keeps everybody from working. We need to resolve that problem and pay people to do the right thing instead of paying people to commit what in many circumstances is a crime against humanity. And I'm looking forward to our Senate and our House passing bills that reduce the number of children taken from families way more than they're being taken now. They have addressed this issue. This issue is being resolved, but being resolved far too slowly. It needs to be resolved so that these families, these victims of abuse by the state-sponsored abuse, are minimized. So, what number of families is it reasonable to rip to shreds? What number of families should be caused lasting harm, pain, sorrow, shame, and terror and anger for the sake of false and frivolous reasons? How many families should be destroyed on those premises? A couple 100,000 like now? Or maybe we should reduce it to 100,000. I think the answer is obvious, that the number of families that should be wrongfully destroyed is zero. The purpose of our government is to prosper rights, to prosper dignity, to prosper the rule of law, not to violate all these principles, lie through their teeth about it, and make their living doing it. And I'm looking forward to our nation doing the right thing, and I'm very proud of my fellow activists and to those lawmakers who stand for these mighty principles, who are bringing this into reality, who are causing this to happen. And that is the story of CPS, how it got to be the way it is, and what we need to do. Thank you for listening.